Welcome back to Secret Speaks. How has your day been? Now let's uncover the mystery hidden in today's story. They thought my silence meant I was finished. My son mocked me. My daughter-in-law planned my erasure, and the family laughed as if I were already gone. But Harold's will carried a secret. Every cruel word they spoke would cost them $1 million. By the time the recording ended, 88 million had vanished, and the mother they buried in words rose to claim everything. The air still smelled of lilies and damp soil when I stepped back into the house in Montecito. My husband Harold had been buried only an hour earlier at the cemetery on the hill, the one with the old oak trees leaning against the Pacific wind. I carried the weight of 68 years on my shoulders, and still the family moved past me as if I were no more than a shadow in my own home. The living room buzzed with laughter. Champagne corks had already popped. I heard the clink of glasses, the shuffle of expensive shoes on the hardwood Harold once polished himself. I held on to the frame of the doorway, the black of my dress heavy against my skin. Daniel, my only son at 42, leaned toward his wife Clarissa, 39, their heads close. His voice carried just enough for me to hear. Do not expect a dime from Dad's 88 million. The words fell like a gavel. Clarissa smirked, her eyes glinting like cut glass. She added with a laugh, "She only ever made soup. Harold built the empire." The heat rose in my chest, slow and steady, but my lips stayed pressed together. My pulse thudded in my ears. I stepped further into the room. No one turned. No one offered a seat. Instead, they sprawled across the leather couches Harold had chosen years ago, the same ones we had saved months to buy in our early marriage. Clarissa stretched her manicured hand across the armrest, as if it had always been hers. I moved past them toward the sideboard. Plates of roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and salad lined the surface. A party not awake. I lifted a plate, but my hand trembled and I set it back down. A cousin laughed about remodeling the den into a spa, another about tearing out the kitchen to add skylights. Their voices overlapped like vultures circling. Daniel's laugh cut through it all. Dad always said she would go first. Guess he was wrong. My throat tightened, but I swallowed hard, forcing air into my lungs. I walked to the dining table. My chair at the head was gone, replaced with a folding chair dragged in from the garage, one leg uneven so it wobbled. They had already shifted me out of my place. I placed my hand on the wood surface where Harold's hand once rested at every meal. The warmth of memory surged, then dissolved in the noise of their chatter. Clarissa raised her glass. To Harold, she said, "He built Hayes Industries from nothing. Now we carry it forward." Laughter erupted, not mourning, but triumph. Someone muttered, "And clear out the ghosts while we are at it." I felt the weight of every eye that did not meet mine. A nephew pointed at the china cabinet where my wedding set still stood. He pulled out a neon sticker, slapped it onto the glass, and grinned. "This one's mine." Another voice shouted from the hallway, "I want the lake house. Dad promised me last summer." The words rattled against my chest like stones. I turned away and walked down the hallway. The sound of their celebration faded behind me, replaced by the silence of old portraits on the walls. Harold in his college years, Daniel as a boy me in a dress that no longer fit. I reached the staircase, placed my hand on the banister Harold once sanded smooth. My legs shook, but I held steady. At the landing, I paused. Through the crack of the door, I heard Clarissa again, her voice sharp as a blade. "She is already half gone. Just a burden." Daniel chuckled in response, low and cruel. Another cousin added, Can we forward her pension checks if she goes?" The group erupted in laughter. My hand slipped into the pocket of my coat. My fingers brushed against the worn leather folder tucked inside the one I had hidden for years. The paper edges were still crisp, a reminder of what they never knew. I let my hand linger there, grounding myself in silence. I stepped into the mudroom, the space that now seemed reserved for me. The scent of bleach and dust filled my nose. A mop leaned in the corner, a rusted bucket beside it. The folding chair creaked under my weight. I folded my hands on my lap and let the stillness cover me. Through the thin wall I heard them again. Let her rot with her memories. She does not even know what year it is. Another voice laughed. Maybe give her the garden shed, call it done. A young cousin giggled. Or the basement, that way we do not have to see her at all. I closed my eyes. The taste of grief and betrayal pressed against the back of my tongue, bitter as iron. But beneath it, a current of something stronger ran through me. They believed I was finished, an old woman tucked away. They did not know the truth waiting in my pocket, nor the years of silence I had carried like armor. The light flickered above, buzzing softly before holding steady. I stared at the cracked tile floor, each mark a reminder of years of scrubbing and patching. I thought of nights Harold came home late, his shoulders heavy, and I had placed food on this same table without asking questions. I thought of Daniel as a boy, climbing onto my lap with scraped knees, his small arms tight around my neck. The memories pressed close, warm, and painful at once. The voices in the next room grew louder. Someone joked about painting the master bedroom pink, another, about tearing out the roses Harold had planted and replacing them with a wine bar. I heard the sound of drawers opening upstairs, suitcases rolling across the floorboards. They were moving in before Harold's body had even cooled. I straightened my back against the folding chair. My pulse slowed, each beat measured. I let the storm of their greed rage on the other side of the wall. I would not give them my tears. Not tonight. The fire inside me did not burn out. It only waited. The stickers came out of a plastic bag as if they were party favors. Neon green, pink, and orange squares fluttered across the room, pressed onto furniture cabinets and walls that had carried my life for decades. A cousin laughed as he slapped one on the grandfather clock. "Mine!" Another shouted from the hallway, "I want the wine rack." The sound of paper peeling from its backing cut sharper than any knife. Michael, only 13, dashed from room to room like it was a game. He pressed a bright yellow sticker onto the side of Harold's leather chair, then another on the oak cabinet. He laughed so loudly that his voice echoed against the high ceiling. "This one's mine." Each time he said it, my stomach tightened. He had no idea what those pieces had meant, only that claiming them gave him power. Clarissa stood in the center of it all, directing the chaos as if it were an auction. She wore a silk blouse the color of wine, her hair perfectly set, her face glowing under the chandelier. She tapped her glass with a spoon to call for attention. "Remember to label what you want before the reading," she said with a smile. "It will be easier that way." Easier for who I wondered, though I already knew the answer. I tried to stand still, invisible, though the sting of each voice reached me. Daniel followed Clarissa's lead, more hesitant, but his smile betrayed his complicity. He placed a green square on the piano, the same piano Harold and I had saved for years to buy the one Daniel had played as a child. He looked away quickly as if shame flickered for only a second before vanishing. The smell of chicken and wine grew stronger as they moved through the rooms, turning my sanctuary into a showroom. Someone joked about tearing out the wallpaper, another about gutting the kitchen. The laughter rose, drowning out the quiet that had once filled these halls. I pressed my hand against the banister, its wood worn smooth by Harold's hand, and forced myself not to tremble. Clarissa's voice rang out again, sharp and cheerful. "The china set is already spoken for," she said, glancing toward her daughter Emily. "Emily, darling, help me mark it." Emily hesitated, her brown eyes flicking to me, then back to her mother. For a moment I saw doubt on her face. She held the roll of stickers in her hand, but did not move. Clarissa tugged her arm. "Go on." Emily pressed a pink square against the glass of the cabinet, her lips pressed tight. I swallowed hard. The cabinet held the china Harold and I had received on our wedding day, pieces I had polished by hand every Thanksgiving. I could almost feel the weight of each dish in my palms, the warmth of candlelight at family dinners, the sound of Harold's laughter echoing around the table. And now a square of paper claimed it as if none of that had ever mattered. I stepped back away from the noise, hoping to find air in the corner of the room. Instead, Clarissa spotted me. She pointed toward the hallway with the coolness of someone assigning a servant. "The mudroom will be more comfortable for you away from the crowd." Her words floated on the air, polite in tone, cutting in truth. Daniel did not protest. No one did. My feet moved without protest. I walked through the corridor, past the portraits and the staircase, each step heavy. The mudroom door creaked when I opened it. Inside, the scent of bleach and dust stung my nose. A folding chair sat against the wall, one leg uneven. Beside it leaned a broom with a frayed handle, and a bucket rusted at the edges. This was the space they thought fit for me. I lowered myself into the chair, the metal cold against the back of my legs. The laughter from the other room seeped through the thin wall, muffled but unrelenting. They toasted Harold as though his empire belonged to them already. I stared at the cracked tile floor, at the faint stains that never seemed to fade no matter how many times I scrubbed. My hands rested on my lap fingers, twitching against the fabric of my dress. Michael burst through the doorway, startled to see me sitting there. He grinned, holding a pack of stickers. "Grandma, do you want one?" he asked, as if it were a harmless joke. Before I could respond, he slapped a neon square onto the sideboard beside me. "This one's mine." Then he darted away, leaving the echo of his laughter in the narrow space. Emily appeared a few minutes later, lingering at the door. Her eyes flicked to me, then down to the floor. She did not smile. Her hand tugged at the sleeve of her cardigan as though she wanted to speak but could not. Clarissa's voice called from the other room. "Emily, come here." Emily gave me a look small, but filled with something unspoken before she turned and walked back into the noise. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees, pressing my hands together until my knuckles ached. My pocket held the worn leather folder I had carried for years, tucked close against me like a secret heartbeat. I let my fingers brush the edge of it, its presence steady, real. They saw me as frail as someone to be set aside with the mops and buckets, but they did not know the truth waiting inside that folder. The voices in the other rooms grew louder again. Someone shouted about the lake house, another claimed the scarves in the bedroom closet. Their greed painted the walls brighter than the stickers themselves. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting their words wash over me. Each sentence carved a deeper line inside me, not of despair, but of resolve. When I opened my eyes, the room was the same. The bulb overhead flickered, then steadied. I straightened my back, my hands firm in my lap. They could drown the house in stickers, they could strip the walls of memory, but they could not erase what I carried. My silence was not weakness. It was preparation. I listened to their laughter, sharp as glass, and let the fire inside me burn hotter. I had been pushed into the mudroom seated on a folding chair beside a broom, but I knew something they did not. This house, this company, this legacy had not been built by Harold alone. The proof was in my hands, waiting. I stayed seated, the thin wall trembling faintly with the rhythm of their steps and their joy. I kept my breathing slow and steady, my gaze fixed ahead. The room they thought would break me became the place I gathered strength. Outside the door, they claimed their prizes. Inside, I held the truth. The night stretched long, but I was ready to endure it. Their celebration was only the beginning. I remembered a winter evening in 2010 when the walls of this same house seemed to close in around us. Harold sat at the kitchen table with his tie loosened, his hands trembling, as he held a stack of papers he could not bring himself to sign. The lamplight threw shadows across his face, deepening the lines carved by months of worry. He said little, but I could read the truth in his silence. Hayes Industries was collapsing. I stood by the stove stirring soup. Neither of us would finish listening to the slow tick of the clock. He muttered about creditors, about contracts lost, about the bank's demands for collateral he did not have. Each word felt like another stone dropped into a well with no bottom. He buried his face in his hands. "I cannot lose it," he whispered. "This company is everything." I wanted to reach for him to tell him we would endure, but instead I walked quietly to the bedroom when he finally fell asleep. In the bottom drawer of my dresser lay a velvet box wrapped in yellowing tissue paper. Inside rested my mother's emerald pendant, the gold bangles Harold had given me on our wedding day, the diamond earrings I had worn at our anniversary dinner. Each piece carried a story, each one a memory etched into my skin. I lifted them one by one, the cool metal pressing into my palm. My reflection wavered in the glass of the mirror as I tried them on for the last time. The emerald pendant lay heavy against my chest. I thought of my mother, her voice telling me to keep it safe, that it would always remind me of where I came from. I pressed it to my lips before setting it back in the box. The next morning, I dressed in a plain coat and walked into town. Santa Barbara's streets were damp from overnight rain, the shop windows reflecting gray light. I carried the velvet box in my handbag, fingers curled tight around the clasp. Inside a jewelry store I had never entered before, the man behind the counter examined each piece with a jeweler's loupe. He named a number. I nodded without hesitation. The money would not bring my heirlooms back, but it could keep Harold's company alive. I signed the papers quickly, my hand steady though my heart raced. The funds were wired directly to the account Hayes Industries had set up for emergency collateral. I asked for no receipt in my name. I wanted no trace, only results. As I left the store, the air smelled of salt from the ocean, sharp and cleansing, though inside me a quiet grief took root. Harold never asked where the money came from. That evening, he returned home with a spark in his eyes I had not seen in months. He said the bank had agreed to extend the line, that investors were still willing to talk. He kissed my cheek with gratitude, but I kept my silence. It was enough to see the weight lifted from his shoulders. In the months that followed, I watched him rebuild piece by piece. By 2012, the company was preparing for an initial public offering. I stayed awake many nights as Harold struggled to craft the proposal that would convince skeptical investors. He paced the den with draft after draft, each one discarded in frustration. One night, I sat at the kitchen table after he went to bed, a cup of chamomile cooling beside me, and I picked up his notes. The industry was shifting. Shipping routes were changing, fuel costs, rising competitors merging. I had studied economics in college before marriage, before Daniel was born, before I was told my place was in the home. I took Harold's discarded notes and began to write, sketching out a plan that accounted for the changes. I proposed restructuring the supply chain, diversifying into coastal logistics, and tying the pitch to the rise of new federal contracts. The pen scratched across the paper until my fingers cramped. I signed it not with my own name, but with the initials M.L. Gray, a name I had once used for articles in a college paper. I folded the pages neatly and mailed them to the Hayes Industries office with no return address. 2 days later, Harold mentioned an anonymous proposal that had arrived brilliant and clear. He laughed, saying even the handwriting looked like mine. I stirred soup and said nothing. That plan became the backbone of the company's IPO. In the spring of 2012, Hayes Industries rang the bell at the New York Stock Exchange. Harold stood tall in his navy suit, Daniel at his side, cameras flashing. The newspapers called him a visionary, a man who had built an empire alone. His face appeared on the cover of business magazines. They called him the miracle of Montecito. I smiled as I clipped the articles and tucked them into a folder. Alone, I repeated the word to myself, tasting its bitterness. No one mentioned the jewelry that had disappeared or the proposal written in my hand. My name was not in the prospectus, not on the patents, not on the contracts. Harold never spoke of it, though, once. In the quiet of our bedroom, he touched my hand and whispered, "Thank you." I did not ask for more. Still, I remembered everything. The empty velvet box hidden beneath linens, the feel of ink on my fingers at dawn, the way the boardroom applauded Harold's brilliance while I sat at home with soup simmering on the stove. They praised him for his strength while I had been asked to erase my own. Now, years later, seated in the mudroom with their laughter echoing through my walls, I let those memories wash over me. Each detail was etched into me like carvings in stone. They thought I had built nothing. They thought I was only soup. They had no idea that the empire they toasted with champagne was built in part by the sacrifices I had buried quietly, by the voice I had silenced, so his could be heard. I rested my hand again on the folder in my lap. The papers inside carried more than numbers and signatures. They carried proof. Proof that silence does not mean absence, and that every sacrifice has a weight that cannot be erased. I sat in the dim light, hearing the muffled sound of stickers peeling in the other rooms, and I breathed slowly. They would learn in time. I had not forgotten. Clarissa called everyone back to the dining room as though she were hosting a gala instead of a gathering after a funeral. The table was set with steak-roasted vegetables, bottles of red wine already uncorked. She stood at the head where Harold once sat, lifting her glass high so the light caught the ruby liquid. Her smile widened when the chatter hushed. To Harold she said, her tone dripping with triumph, "He built Hayes Industries, and now it is our turn to carry it forward. We will modernize, we will expand, and we will place it in the hands of those prepared for the future." The words hung heavy in the air. Daniel sat beside her. His tie loosened, the same tie he had worn at the graveside hours earlier. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but when Clarissa slid her hand over his, he forced a smile. His eyes darted toward me once, then back to his plate. He said nothing. Around the table, cousins and in-laws clapped their hands. Michael cheered, raising his glass of soda. Emily sat quietly, her fork pushing at the carrots on her plate, her gaze fixed on the tablecloth. Clarissa's voice filled the silence again, smooth and commanding. Hayes Industries cannot stay trapped in the past. Harold's way was powerful, but it is time for the next generation. I felt my chest tighten. Every syllable pressed down on me, not for what she said about Harold, but for how she dismissed the years I had poured into that company's survival. She spoke as if I had never existed, as if Harold had single-handedly dragged the firm from ruin. My jaw ached from holding back the words that rose inside me. Clarissa's laughter rang out sharp as a bell. She lifted her glass again, turning her gaze to Daniel. My husband is ready to lead. He knows the business, he has the vision. With him at the front, we will secure contracts, expand our reach, and honor Harold's legacy. Daniel nodded, his mouth opening and closing like a man searching for words that never came. Finally, he muttered, "Yes, we will." His voice cracked, but Clarissa's grip on his arm steadied him. The room erupted in approval. I set down my fork, the food tasteless in my mouth. My eyes swept the table, tracing each face. Some looked at Clarissa with admiration, others with thinly veiled greed. None looked at me. I had been erased, relegated to the shadows of the mudroom, even as I sat in the same room. Clarissa leaned closer to Daniel, whispering something that carried just far enough. She will not stand in the way. She is too tired, too old. Daniel did not protest. He pressed his lips together and nodded faintly, eyes fixed on his plate. I forced myself to breathe slowly. My hand brushed against my lap, where the folder rested under layers of fabric. They believed I had nothing. They believed Harold's empire was theirs to divide. They did not see that the foundation they praised had been laid by sacrifices too deep to erase. The meal carried on with loud voices and louder laughter. Cousins planned vacations to the lake house. An aunt asked about auctioning some of Harold's art. Clarissa directed every decision as though she were already mistress of it all. Emily's small voice broke through the noise. What if Grandma wants to keep something? Her eyes met mine across the table, a flicker of courage there. Clarissa's face hardened. Hush, Emily. We are making plans for the future. Emily lowered her gaze, pushing her plate away. My heart swelled at her words, but ached at how quickly they had been dismissed. Clarissa tapped her glass again, reclaiming attention. Let us toast to the new chapter of Hayes Industries. To Daniel, to family, and to progress. Glasses lifted, voices echoed. I lifted nothing. My hands stayed folded in my lap, steady quiet, while fire burned behind my ribs. The night dragged on. Dishes clattered, bottles emptied, laughter filled every corner. I sat still, letting their words carve themselves into memory. They believed they had silenced me. They believed obedience and age had dulled my mind. I let them believe it. When at last the plates were cleared and the guests drifted toward the living room, Clarissa leaned close to Daniel again. We cannot let her interfere. She belongs in the past. Daniel gave a weak smile, his eyes tired, but he did not argue. I rose quietly, my chair scraping the floor. No one noticed. I stepped into the hallway, the sound of laughter following me like an echo I could not shake. The portraits on the wall seemed to watch me. Harold's smile frozen in time. I paused beneath his picture, tracing the frame with my fingertips. The night air pressed through the windows, cool and sharp. I drew a slow breath, steadying my hands. They had declared victory, toasted to their future, dismissed me as if I were already gone. But I carried something stronger than their words. I carried memory proof and a silence that was not surrender, but preparation. I walked toward the back of the house, the sound of celebration fading behind me. Each step was careful, deliberate, echoing against the tile. They thought the story ended here with Clarissa's triumph and Daniel's compliance. I knew better. I had lived through storms before, and storms always left behind clean air. The night had grown heavy with laughter and clinking glasses when I stepped out onto the back porch. The air was cool scented with the faint trace of roses Harold had planted years ago. My ears rang with the echoes of Clarissa's toasts, her words still burning against my chest. I needed silence, even if just for a moment, so I pushed open the door and let the chill embrace me. Across the lawn, the lights from the Cooper house glowed warm through their kitchen window. Linda Cooper had been our neighbor for more than 30 years. She was hanging a dish towel over her shoulder when she glanced out and saw me. A moment later, the side gate creaked and she crossed the grass, her cardigan pulled tight against the wind. "Margaret," she said softly, her voice full of the gentleness I had not heard all evening. "What are they doing in there? It sounds like a party?" Her eyes searched my face and I felt my throat tighten. My hands gripped the railing. Inside they are dividing what is not yet theirs. I tried to steady my voice, but it wavered. Linda's brow furrowed. Harold has only just been laid to rest. How can they sit and celebrate like this? I shook my head. They have no room for grief, only appetite. She moved closer, lowering her voice. I saw Clarissa at the head of the table through the window. She looked like a queen giving orders, and Daniel, he just sat there. My lips pressed tight. Yes, he sat there. Linda's hand rested gently on my arm. "Margaret, why do you let them do this to you?" I looked out across the yard, the moonlight catching the faded petals of the roses. Because silence can hold more power than they understand. She sighed, her breath a cloud in the night air. I always knew Clarissa had ambition, but this, to treat you like a guest in your own home. Not even a guest, I whispered. A burden. The word hung between us, cold and sharp. Linda's eyes shone with sympathy, but beneath it I caught a flicker of anger. "They cannot erase what you have done," she said firmly. "I remember when Hayes Industries nearly collapsed. I remember seeing you walk to town with that velvet box." Her words startled me. "You knew." She nodded slowly. "I did not say anything, but I knew. I saw the way your hand shook when you came back." For a moment my chest ached with the relief of being seen. Someone outside these walls had noticed. From inside came another burst of laughter, a cheer raised to Daniel's supposed new leadership. The sound carried into the night like an insult. Linda's face hardened. "They act like you have vanished, but you are right here." I drew in a deep breath, the night air filling my lungs with steadiness. Their voices may be louder, but I have memory on my side. Linda gave my arm a squeeze. "If you need someone to tell the truth when the time comes, you know where to find me." The weight of her words pressed against me like a promise. I nodded, unable to speak. She gave me one last look, then turned back toward her house, her figure swallowed by the glow of her kitchen light. I stayed on the porch alone again, the night cool against my skin. Inside, Clarissa's voice rose above the others, toasting progress, toasting the future, her laughter ringing out like a bell. I closed my eyes and let the sound wash over me. The roses rustled in the wind, their leaves brittle but still clinging. The porch boards creaked under my feet as I shifted my weight. For years, this had been the place Harold and I sat on summer evenings, the place we drank iced tea and listened to the crickets. Now it felt like a watchtower, a place to stand guard against those who had turned our home into a marketplace. I opened my eyes and looked back through the window. Clarissa raised her glass again, Daniel sitting obediently at her side, the family clapping in rhythm. They did not look out, did not see me standing there. To them I had already disappeared. I let the curtain fall back into place and stepped inside, closing the porch door quietly behind me. The hallway stretched ahead dim and still lined with portraits whose eyes seemed to follow me. I walked slowly past them, feeling the silence of the house pressing close. Their celebrations swelled behind closed doors, but in the quiet corridor I felt something different take root inside me. Linda had seen. Linda had remembered. I was not invisible, not entirely. The truth had witnesses, and that was enough for now. I reached the staircase and paused at the banister Harold had polished so many years ago. My hand rested on the smooth wood, steady and firm. Upstairs, the sound of drawers opening and closing carried faintly down the hall. More stickers, more claims. I closed my eyes for a moment and drew in another breath, deep and calm. Then I turned back toward the mudroom, my steps measured, my posture straight. They could claim the furniture, the art, the china, even the roses outside, but they could not claim me. The night was long, but I would endure it, and every word they spoke carved the path more clearly. Their laughter rose again, muffled but unmistakable. I pressed my hand once more against the folder in my pocket. The truth waited patient and sharp, and I would carry it until the moment it was needed. I closed the porch door softly behind me and let the echo of their laughter fade into the walls. The house smelled of bleach and dust, the air thick with memories that clung to every corner. I walked down the hallway to the laundry room, the space they had decided was suitable for me, and stood in the middle of it listening. Their voices carried through the vents, muffled but clear enough to wound. My eyes fell to the floorboards near the utility sink. I had walked over those planks countless times, mopping, folding, scrubbing away stains, but beneath them was something no one else knew about. My knees bent with the weight of age and resolve as I lowered myself to the floor. The bulb above me flickered once, then steadied, casting a thin yellow light across the cracked tile. I pressed my palm against the board that had always felt looser than the others. With effort, I pried it up the wood, groaning softly, as if reluctant to reveal what it had hidden for more than a decade. Dust rose clinging to my dress, but I did not care. I reached down and pulled out the leather folder worn smooth from my hands and time. The smell of aged paper filled my nose as I unclasped it. The first document lay on top, its edges browned slightly. It was a memorandum from the First Savings Bank of California, dated in 2010, stamped in blue ink. My name stood alongside Harold's, not tucked in as a dependent, but written in the clear line of a cosigner. I ran my fingers along the ink, remembering the day I had sold everything that mattered in order to produce that sum. I saw again the velvet box resting on my dresser, the jewelry I had promised my mother I would guard. The emerald pendant, the bangles Harold had clasped around my wrists on our wedding day, the earrings I had worn on our 30th anniversary. I remembered slipping them into my handbag one cold morning, walking into Santa Barbara with my heart pounding. I had stepped into a jewelry store I had never entered before. The man behind the counter peered at me through a magnifying glass, named a price that felt both devastating and inevitable. I nodded. I signed. The funds moved to Hayes Industries, and Harold's company was saved. I turned the page to the second set of papers, and the sight of my own handwriting made my throat ache. The ink was blue bold where the nib had pressed too hard, lighter where my hand had trembled from exhaustion. It was the strategy I had written late one night at the kitchen table while Harold paced upstairs in despair. The numbers spilled from me like water charts and projections that accounted for shifting trade routes, government contracts, and cost reforms. I had once dreamed of a life in economics before Daniel was born, before I was told my place was at home. That night, those dreams came alive again. I remembered the scrape of the chair legs on the tile as I sat through the night, the taste of cold chamomile on my lips. The house was silent except for the wind scratching across the porch and the clock ticking on the wall. I don't know. My fingers were cramped and smudged with ink, but the plan was whole. I signed it with the name I had used in college, M.L. Gray, folded the pages carefully, and mailed them without a return address. 2 days later, Harold returned from the office, his eyes alight for the first time in months. He waved the anonymous proposal in his hand and said it was brilliant. He never asked me where it had come from. He only laughed and said the handwriting looked familiar. The strategy became the backbone of the IPO. In 2012, Hayes Industries rang the opening bell in New York. Harold stood tall in a navy suit, Daniel beside him, cameras flashing. The board called him a genius, a visionary who had carried the company from the brink of collapse. I clipped the newspaper articles, pasted them in a scrapbook. Each headline read the same word, alone. I smiled for the cameras as the wife who had stood beside him, but inside, I whispered the truth to myself. The third item in the folder was a letter. Harold's hand was strong in its strokes, though the paper had yellowed with time. He had written, "Forgive me for letting them think I built it without you. I always knew whose hand carried the weight." He had folded the page, neatly tucked it away where he thought I might someday find it. I pressed the letter to my lips, and the grief I had carried for years welled up fresh. He had known. He had chosen silence just as I had. I stacked the documents back together and sat in the dim glow of the laundry room. For years I had told myself it was better this way, that Harold needed the glory more than I did, that the world would not follow a woman's name. I had been content to feed him strength from the shadows, to let his image stand tall while I erased my own. But tonight, after hearing Clarissa raise her glass as if she were queen, after watching Daniel nod along as if Harold's empire had never needed anyone else, I understood that silence was no longer a kindness. Through the thin wall, their laughter rolled again, careless and loud. Someone shouted about redecorating the master bedroom, another about repainting the den. Michael's voice carried, still gleeful with his stickers. The sound scraped against me like sandpaper. My hands clenched around the folder, knuckles white. They thought they had already buried me with Harold, that my voice had no power left. But ghosts do not carry evidence. I did. I slid the folder back into its hiding place, pressing the board down until it settled flush again. My knees protested as I pushed myself upright, but my spine stayed straight. The bulb above me buzzed faintly, then steadied, casting me in its pale glow. I smoothed my dress and walked back toward the hallway. The portraits lining the wall watched me as I passed Harold's younger face, smiling forever in a suit too large for his shoulders. My fingers brushed the edge of the frame. "You knew," I whispered silently to him, "and now they will too." The celebration roared on in the dining room glasses, clinking voices overlapping in greed. I paused at the threshold but did not step in. Instead, I stood in the shadows, listening, my hand resting lightly over my chest, where the folder's weight had been. They could mark every chair with their stickers, laugh at every memory, toast to every false claim. I carried the one thing they could not touch. The truth waited, and I, patient as stone, was ready to bring it into the light. The morning after their feast of claims, I walked 2 blocks through the cool air of Santa Barbara to the brick office building where Alden Wright practiced law. The brass letters on the door gleamed in the sun, steady and sure, much like the man himself. Alden had been Harold's attorney for decades, but he had always treated me with quiet respect. When I stepped inside, he rose from behind his desk and offered a seat as if he had been expecting me all along. "Margaret?" He said, his voice calm but serious. "I wondered how long it would take before you came." I eased into the leather chair, my folder clutched tightly in my lap. The silence stretched before I found my words. "They think I am finished, Alden. They think I am nothing more than an old woman in the way." His eyes studied me, steady, patient. "But you are not. Otherwise you would not be here." I placed the folder on his desk and slid it toward him. He opened it carefully, his hands slow and deliberate. He read the bank memorandum first, his brow lifting slightly at the signatures. Then he examined the handwritten strategy, his fingers tracing the blue ink. When he reached Harold's letter, his lips pressed together in a thin line. "This is substantial," he said at last. "More than substantial. This is irrefutable." My breath caught, but I forced myself to steady. "They will deny it. Clarissa Daniel, all of them. They will call me senile, say I invented it after the fact." Alden leaned back, folding his hands across his chest. "That is why we will not rely on your word alone. Harold's will contains a provision you may not be aware of." I frowned. "A provision." "It is called an in terrorem clause. Harold insisted on including it last year. It states that any heir who speaks ill of you, whether in life or after his death, forfeits $1 million from their inheritance for every offense." I stared at him, the words sinking slowly into place. He nodded, his expression grave. "We have security system recordings from the house dated just days after Harold's passing. The things they said, Margaret, it will not be difficult to prove." The memory of Daniel's voice, cruel and careless, echoed in my ears. "She built soup. Harold built an empire." Clarissa's laughter, sharp and bright, cut through the room. I pressed my palm against the arm of the chair to keep from trembling. Alden continued, "Every word is logged, time-stamped, and verifiable. When the will is read, the deductions will be automatic." My lips parted, but no sound came. At last I whispered, "They will have nothing left." "That depends on how much they chose to say," he replied evenly. "But Margaret, there is more." He tapped the handwritten strategy lying between us. "If we can confirm authorship, not only does it prove your role in saving Hayes Industries, it also establishes your intellectual property rights." My pulse quickened. "How do we prove it?" Alden reached for his phone and pressed a button. Within minutes, a woman entered the office, tall, silver-haired, her eyes bright behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Margaret, this is Dr. Susan Clark. She is a handwriting analyst and forensic document examiner from Stanford." Dr. Clark extended her hand. "It is a pleasure. I hear you may have written something very important." I opened my mouth, but my throat tightened. I managed a nod and pushed the pages toward her. She slipped on a pair of gloves and studied the papers under a magnifying lamp Alden placed on the desk. Her fingers traced the strokes, the loops of the letters, the pressure points where the pen had dug deeper into the page. "Do you still write regularly?" she asked, without looking up. "Every day," I answered quietly. "Journals, letters, recipes." "Good," she said. "I will need samples." I retrieved a small notebook from my handbag, the one I carried everywhere, pages filled with lists and notes in the same steady hand. She compared them carefully, her eyes narrowing, her lips pressing together. After a long silence, she straightened, removing her gloves. "The match is conclusive. Whoever wrote these strategy pages is the same person who wrote in your notebook. The ink is consistent with the period as well, early 2010s. This is your work." My eyes blurred as relief pressed against me. After years of silence, someone finally spoke the truth aloud. Alden's voice broke the stillness. With this confirmation, Margaret, the intellectual property rights tied to that IPO are yours. Every royalty, every licensing fee, every recognition. I shook my head slowly. I never wanted the money. Then what do you want? Alden asked gently. I looked at the papers between us, the proof of years erased. I want them to see. I want the truth spoken in a room where they cannot laugh it away. Alden nodded once firm. Then that is what we will do. We spent the next hour in quiet discussion. He explained the order of the reading, the evidence he would introduce, the way the deductions would be calculated word by word. I listened carefully, though my thoughts drifted often to Harold's voice, to the laughter that had filled my dining room only nights before. They believed I was powerless. They had no idea the weight of law was already aligned against them. When I left Alden's office, the afternoon sun was slipping low over the ocean, painting the horizon in bands of orange and purple. I walked slowly down the street, my bag heavier now, though the folder inside had not changed. I passed the storefront where I had once sold my mother's pendant, the glass still gleaming, the memory still sharp. I did not falter. The breeze carried the scent of salt and eucalyptus as I reached the corner and paused. For the first time in years, my shoulders felt lighter. The truth was no longer just mine to guard. It had been seen, verified, and prepared for the moment it would matter most. I turned toward home, the long shadow of the courthouse stretching across the pavement. The night ahead would be filled with more laughter, more plans made at my expense. But I knew what waited, patient and certain, ready to be revealed. That same week, Clarissa shifted her attention from the house to the company, as if one conquest was never enough. She swept through the hallways with folders tucked under her arm, rehearsing lines for Daniel as though she were his tutor. Her voice carried sharp and clear, filling the silence I had once claimed as my refuge. "You cannot stumble," she told him while knotting his tie. "The board expects certainty. They need to see you as Harold's heir, not as a man still under his mother's shadow." Daniel fidgeted, his hands awkward against the lapels of his jacket. "What if they ask about revenue or contracts?" he muttered. Clarissa adjusted his collar, her eyes flashing with irritation. "Then you repeat what we practiced. Hayes must modernize. We are building the future, not protecting ghosts." Her glance flicked toward me where I stood by the staircase, quiet and watchful. A smirk curled at her mouth, daring me to speak. I didn't. My silence was a weapon she did not understand. That afternoon, their car rolled down the driveway, tires crunching against gravel. I remained at the window watching the taillights vanish into the distance and felt the air of the house grow heavier in their absence. Harold's roses sagged in the garden petals scattered across the path. I whispered to them as though they were listening, telling them to endure because I would. Later, I overheard Daniel's voice carrying down the hall as he spoke on the phone. Clarissa had guided him into the boardroom like a general leading a soldier. David Miller, the chairman at 72, had presided at the long, polished table. The walls of that room had once echoed with Harold's certainty, but now hesitation hung in the air. Daniel stumbled through his lines, repeating Clarissa's phrases. "We must take Hayes Industries forward. The company cannot remain tied to the past. My father built it, but it is time for the next generation." His voice trembled, but Clarissa steadied him with a hand on his arm, her own words cutting in when his failed. She lifted her chin and declared with a smile that chilled me even through Daniel's retelling. "The company cannot afford to let an old woman stand in the way of progress. She said it with the ease of someone slicing fabric, swift and clean. For a moment silence fell. Papers shuffled, chairs creaked. No one challenged her. David Miller leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable, his fingers steepled as though weighing words too heavy to release. He had known me for decades, shared dinners at my table, sent Christmas cards with polite notes. Yet he said nothing. Some directors shifted uncomfortably, others stared at the grain of the wood. None raised a voice. None asked who that old woman was or what she had done to be cast aside so easily. Daniel recounted it all later in fragments, his tone weary as though he already regretted it, but lacked the strength to resist her. I told them we would honor Dad's vision by modernizing. Clarissa cut in before I could finish saying the board should not worry about attachments that belong to another era. Attachments. That was the word she chose to name me. I stood in the hallway listening, my hand pressed to the wall for balance. Every syllable seared me, not for its cruelty, but for its confidence. She believed she had already won, that her voice would rewrite the history of a company built not only on Harold's back, but on mine. I pictured the boardroom as clearly as if I had been seated there. The high windows letting in the Santa Barbara light, the smell of polished wood and old leather. Harold once commanding the room with his steady tone, and now Clarissa sharp as glass filling the silence with ambition, while Daniel sat as her echo. When Daniel ended the call, I heard Clarissa's laugh behind him, light and triumphant. They thought the board had bent. They mistook hesitation for approval. But I knew better. David Miller's silence was not loyalty. It was fear. He had seen enough of corporate wars to know when a storm was forming. Clarissa believed quiet meant consent. I recognized it as the tremor before a crack. I walked to the window, pulling the curtain aside. The evening sky was streaked in orange and purple, the kind of colors Harold used to stop and admire, no matter how busy the day. My reflection stared back at me in the glass, older lined with grief and resolve. They could twist words in a boardroom, they could mock me in my own dining room, but the documents hidden under my floor carried more weight than any toast or speech. Law and memory were patient allies. I let the curtain fall and turned toward the staircase. My hand rested on the banister Harold had polished smooth with years of care. Each step creaked softly under my feet, familiar and grounding. Upstairs, the house was silent, but the echoes of their ambition clung to the air. Clarissa thought she had silenced me by speaking in places I could not enter. She mistook absence for defeat. But the truth does not need a seat at the table to survive. It waits, it listens, and when the moment arrives, it speaks louder than any voice that tried to bury it. I paused at the top of the stairs, the dim light pooling across the hall. My chest rose steady, my pulse even. They believed themselves untouchable, but every plan they laid only pulled them closer to the reckoning, waiting in Harold's will and in my hands. The night pressed close around me, heavy and still. Yet in that stillness I felt something sharpen, something unbroken. They had the boardroom and their applause of silence. I had the truth, and truth, unlike loyalty, does not waver. Clarissa filled every corner of the house with her presence, her voice carrying over the clink of glasses and the scrape of chairs. She laughed loudly, retelling the story of how she had spoken at the board meeting, how even David Miller, old and cautious, had not dared to contradict her. Daniel sat beside her, nodding faintly, his smile weak, the weight of her ambition pressing against him like iron. I stood in the hallway just beyond the doorway, unseen, listening, as Clarissa shifted her tone. She leaned toward the circle of relatives gathered around the fire. We cannot let her hold us back. Harold's company deserves the future, not the past. Margaret is nothing but a weight dragging us down. She will fade soon enough, and when she does, we will finally be free. The words were spoken with ease, as though they were no more than a toast. My breath caught in my chest, each syllable carving into me. I pressed a hand to the door frame, the wood cool beneath my fingers. A murmur of laughter rose from the group, the sound sharp and careless. Daniel gave a half-hearted chuckle. He avoided my eyes even though he knew I was near. His silence wounded me more deeply than Clarissa's cruelty. He had once clung to me during storms as a boy had once whispered his fears when college letters came back stamped with rejection. Now he sat still, letting his wife cut me from his life piece by piece. Near the mantel, Emily stood quietly, her arms folded across her chest. The firelight flickered against her face, catching the tension in her jaw. She was 16, caught between childhood and womanhood, but in her eyes I saw the storm. Her mother's words had stirred. She glanced toward me, her lips parting as if to speak, then she pressed them shut again. Clarissa's laughter filled the room, drowning out the fragile courage that flickered in Emily's silence. I entered the room slowly, each step deliberate. The laughter dimmed for a moment, but quickly rose again like a tide reclaiming the shore. Clarissa waved a dismissive hand toward a folding chair near the wall. "Sit there, Margaret, you will be more comfortable." The words dripped with false sweetness, the kind reserved for children or burdens. I lowered myself into the chair, folding my hands in my lap. My gaze fixed on the fire, the crackle of the log steady against the tide of voices. The warmth reached my skin, but did not touch the chill lodged inside me. Then I felt a gentle tug at my sleeve. I turned startled and found Emily at my side. Her voice was no louder than a breath. "I believe you, Grandma." For a moment the world around me dissolved. The chatter faded, the fire's crackle dimmed, and all I could hear were those words. My heart swelled and ached in the same instant. I leaned closer, my own voice trembling. "What did you say?" Her eyes lifted steady now despite the fear flickering in her hands. "I believe you. You are not what she says." Tears burned at the edge of my vision, though I held them back. For years I had endured silence, mockery, dismissal, and here in the heart of betrayal came a whisper of faith. Clarissa's voice rang out again, sharp as glass. "Emily, come here. Do not bother your grandmother." Emily froze, her eyes still locked on mine. For a single heartbeat she stood firm, then she turned slowly, walking back toward her mother. Clarissa wrapped an arm around her shoulders, smiling broadly as she launched into another story about future renovations, about stripping away what remained of Harold's taste. The room laughed again, none of them noticing the quiet rebellion flickering in Emily's gaze. Later, as plates of dessert were passed around and the noise rose higher, Emily slipped back to my side. She leaned close, her voice urgent but hushed. "They do not see you, but I do. I know she is wrong." I reached for her hand, squeezing gently. My voice was steady, though my chest trembled. "You are braver than you know, Emily." Her grip tightened, then she released me quickly, her glance darting toward Clarissa. "I will not forget," she whispered before stepping away. I sat still, the laughter and clinking of forks swirling around me like smoke. Clarissa believed she controlled every heart in that house that her words could shape. Daniel sway the board, erase me. But Emily had pierced the silence with a single truth. Hours later, when the guests began drifting away and the house grew quieter, I stood near the staircase watching Emily linger in the hall. Clarissa called to her, sharply demanding she help clear plates. Emily looked back at me once more, her expression clear and fierce in a way that only I seemed to notice. I climbed the stairs slowly, my hand on the banister Harold had polished for years. Behind me, Clarissa's voice carried commanding, triumphant, but no longer unchallenged. The echo of Emily's whisper walked with me, a fragile light in the shadows. I reached the landing and paused, my heart heavy, yet steadier than it had been in days. They could strip the house toast to their false futures and call me a burden, but they had not silenced every voice. One thread of loyalty remained woven into the fabric of betrayal. That thread was enough to remind me I was not alone. And sometimes the smallest spark is what sets the fire that cannot be contained. The morning of the will reading, the sky over Santa Barbara was low and gray, the kind of sky that pressed against the earth with a weight of silence. I walked into the law office with steady steps, the smell of leather and polished wood greeting me. My coat was plain beige and worn at the cuffs, but I held my head high. Inside, the glass-walled conference room chairs had been arranged around a long table. Daniel and Clarissa were already seated at the front, their postures straight, their faces smug. Clarissa whispered something to Daniel, and he chuckled loud enough for everyone to hear. Alden Wright entered with his briefcase, and the room stilled. He set the case on the table and adjusted his glasses. His presence alone carried the weight of finality. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice calm but unyielding. "Today we execute the final will and testament of Harold Hayes." I sat near the end of the table, a folding chair once again, as if they wanted to remind me of my place. I folded my hands in my lap and let my eyes rest on the surface of the table, polished so bright it reflected the fluorescent lights above. My breath was steady, though my pulse quickened. Alden opened the folder and began. "This will contain standard provisions, but also an addendum Harold insisted upon." He clicked a small silver recorder, and the sound of Harold's voice filled the room. Slow, deliberate, weary, yet certain. "If my son or his wife speak ill of his mother for each word, a deduction of $1 million will be made from their inheritance." The air in the room shifted. Clarissa's smile faltered. Daniel frowned, his jaw tightening. Alden pressed play again, and a new recording began. It was not Harold's voice now, but the cold echo of the home security system, dated and verified. "She is still breathing. Thought she would be gone by now." Daniel's voice. "My son. My flesh." Laughter followed on the tape, then another clip. "She built soup. Harold built an empire." The room went utterly still. Clarissa shifted in her chair, her nails tapping the table. Another clip played. "She belongs in the laundry room. She is nothing but a burden. Better to put her in a nursing home and be done with it." Clarissa's voice sharp, undeniable. My fingers dug into the fabric of my skirt. The words I had heard in the house now played back in a room full of witnesses, each one branded with a price. Alden read from the transcript as the audio continued. Statement 1. Deduction $1 million. Statement 2. Deduction $1 million. The list went on, each cruel sentence matched with its cost. Daniel's shoulders sagged as the tally grew. Clarissa tried to interrupt. "This is absurd." She demanded to know how Harold could have added such a clause. Alden raised his hand, silencing her. "The recordings are authenticated. The clause is legally binding." He turned the page, and his voice remained steady. "Total deductions for Mr. Daniel Hayes and Mrs. Clarissa Hayes amount to $88 million. The air left the room like a vacuum. Silence, sharp and heavy, pressed against every wall. Daniel shot to his feet, his chair clattering backward. This is not possible. He cannot do this. His voice cracked. Alden's gaze did not waver. He did Mr. Hayes. The clause was notarized and filed. Clarissa leaned forward, her voice high and brittle. This is a trick. She is behind this. She pointed at me, her finger trembling with fury. She poisoned him against us. I looked up for the first time, my voice low but clear. I did nothing but endure your words. You gave away your fortune all by yourselves. Word by word. Gasps circled the table. Some of the younger relatives lowered their eyes. Others stared at me as if seeing me for the first time. Daniel's face drained of color. Clarissa's hand clawed at his sleeve, but he pulled away, turning his anger on her. You pushed me. You said those things too. You told me to agree. His voice shook, but his blame spilled out in desperate waves. Clarissa snapped back, her voice sharp as glass. You were weak. You let her linger. You could not even silence your own mother. Their argument cracked through the silence, husband and wife tearing at each other while the rest of the room sat frozen. Alden closed the folder and let them rage, his calm composure unbroken. I remained seated, my hands still folded in my lap, my breath steady. The words that had wounded me for weeks now echoed back against them with the weight of law. They had laughed at me, erased me, reduced me to nothing more than soup and burden. And now those words had cost them everything. The room stayed hushed, heavy with disbelief. Daniel slumped back into his chair, his face pale, his eyes glassy. Clarissa's hand shook as she reached for a glass of water, spilling half of it across the table. No one moved to help her. I looked at the polished surface before me, at the faint reflection of the woman they thought they had buried long ago. For once, I did not feel invisible. I felt undeniable. The silence held thick and bone deep as Alden prepared to read the next section of the will. Daniel's lips trembled as if he wanted to speak, but the sound would not come. His face had gone pale, beads of sweat forming at his temple despite the cool air that hummed from the vents above. Clarissa looked from Alden to the rest of the family, her smile frozen in place, brittle and cracking at the edges. For the first time since Harold's funeral, the certainty in her eyes faltered. Alden cleared his throat and repeated it with slow precision, as though chiseling the words into stone. The balance of inheritance for Mr. Daniel Hayes and Mrs. Clarissa Hayes stands at 0. The number or the absence of one sank like a stone in water. The silence deepened until it felt as though even the walls of the law office held their breath. Clarissa jolted first. She slammed her hand on the polished table, the glasses rattling, and a pen rolling to the floor. Her voice burst out, shrill and furious. This is wrong. This is ridiculous. We gave our lives to this family. She turned on Daniel, her nails digging into his sleeve. And you let this happen. Daniel shoved her hand off, his own voice breaking as it rose. My fault. You laughed the loudest. Your words are on that recording too. You called her a burden. You told me to agree. Her cheeks flushed crimson, her eyes flashing. I told you to be careful. I told you to shut your mouth, but you never could. You mocked her at every turn. You thought it was funny. He lurched to his feet, the chair clattering backward. Do not blame me, Clarissa. You drove this. You pushed and pushed, whispering that we needed her gone, that the house would be ours, that the company would be yours to play queen. His voice cracked, desperation leaking through anger. Gasps circled the table. Some relatives shifted uncomfortably, staring down at their hands. Others exchanged uneasy glances. The air smelled faintly of fear, like static before a storm. Clarissa's voice rose again, sharp as glass shattering. "You weak, spineless man. You could not even silence your own mother. You let her rot in that laundry room, and still you failed." Her words pierced me, but I no longer flinched. Instead, I rose from my chair, the scrape against the floor, deliberate, commanding attention. I pressed my palms against the table and looked at them both. My voice was low but steady, carrying across the room with a clarity that stilled even their shouting. "I did not take your inheritance." Every head turned toward me. The rage between Daniel and Clarissa stalled, caught in the web of my calm. I let the silence stretch a moment longer before speaking again. "You gave it away yourselves. Word by word." The phrase cut sharper than any accusation. It was the truth, plain and unpolished. Clarissa's lips parted, her chest heaving, but no retort came. Daniel collapsed back into his chair, his face ashen, his hands gripping the edge of the table like a drowning man clutching driftwood. I straightened slowly, smoothing the front of my coat. I wanted them to see me not as a shadow or burden, but as the woman who had endured every word and now stood unbroken. My gaze swept the table, meeting each pair of eyes. "All of you heard? All of you know what those words cost." A cousin at the far end shifted uneasily. An aunt lowered her eyes. No one defended Daniel or Clarissa. No one dared. Clarissa's fury turned inward, her eyes blazing at Daniel. "This is your fault." She spat the words like poison. "You never had control. Father always doubted you. I told you to stand strong, and you never could." Daniel shook his head violently, his voice hoarse. "No. He doubted you. He told me once he thought you were dangerous. He was right." The two of them spiraled, clawing at each other with words meant to wound deeper than any cut. Their marriage, once a facade of unity, cracked wide open under the weight of their own betrayal. I remained standing, my breath calm, watching as the empire they believed belonged to them dissolved in front of the entire family. Alden closed the folder with quiet finality. "The will is executed as written." He leaned back, his expression unyielding. "There is nothing further to contest." Clarissa's hand shook as she reached for a glass of water, tipping it so that it spilled across the papers in front of her. She cursed under her breath, fumbling for a napkin, but no one moved to help her. Daniel rubbed his face with both hands, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of his own words finally crushed him. He looked older in that moment, broken, no longer the confident man who had walked into the room certain of victory. I drew in a steady breath, my voice calm, though it vibrated with the strength of years held in silence. I endured every insult, every laugh, every dismissal, and now you see what it has cost. Not me. You. Clarissa glared at me with eyes full of fire, but her hands trembled, betraying her. Daniel could not even lift his gaze. Around us, the silence grew heavy again. The younger cousins whispered to each other, eyes wide with disbelief. Catherine, Daniel's eldest, bit her lip so hard it turned white. Michael stared at the floor, the bravado of his stickers gone. I let my words hang, the truth undeniable. "I am not the thief of your fortune. You are. Word by word." The echo of it filled the room like a verdict. Clarissa slumped in her chair, her fury collapsing into despair. Daniel rubbed his temples, his face gray with shock. I stood a little taller, adjusting my coat as the weight of the moment settled. I had not raised my voice, I had not screamed. Yet the truth had thundered louder than all their shouting. The room remained frozen, caught between shame and silence. The battle they thought they had won was over undone, not by my anger, but by their own words. And as I looked at them broken and empty-handed, I knew Harold's claws had done exactly what he intended. It had not only protected me, it had revealed them. The silence in the room held until I heard the sound of a chair scraping against the floor. Emily rose from her seat, her hands trembling, her eyes wide with tears. She crossed the space between us without hesitation and wrapped her arms around me. The warmth of her embrace cut through the cold air of that office, steady and sure. For a moment I closed my eyes and let myself lean into it, my heart swelling with the certainty that not all bonds had been broken. Alden cleared his throat and shifted the stack of documents in front of him. His voice was calm, steady, carrying the weight of finality. According to the terms of this will, the remainder of the estate, including Hayes Industries, the Montecito property and intellectual property rights valued at approximately $5 million, are transferred in full to Margaret Hayes. The words fell like stones into still water, sending ripples through every corner of the room. Daniel's head snapped up, his eyes wide and bloodshot. Clarissa gasped as if struck, her hands clawing at the arm of her chair. The rest of the family sat frozen, stunned into silence. I remained still, Emily's arms wrapped tightly around me, her hair brushing against my cheek. I whispered into her ear so only she could hear. "You see, my darling, words have power." She nodded, her shoulders shaking. Clarissa found her voice first shrill and desperate. "This is theft." She pointed at me with a trembling finger. "She manipulated him. She poisoned Harold against us." Alden did not flinch. "The will was signed, witnessed, and notarized. All provisions have been upheld. There is nothing further to contest." Daniel sank back into his chair, his shoulders slumped, his eyes hollow. His voice cracked when he spoke. "We are ruined." He looked at Clarissa as though seeing her for the first time. "You wanted everything. Now we have nothing." Their argument began again, voices rising, accusations tearing through the room, but no one listened. Relatives turned their faces away, some shaking their heads in disgust. What little respect remained for Daniel and Clarissa drained out like water from a cracked glass. I stood Emily at my side and walked toward the door. Each step was deliberate, the sound of my heels against the floor, a rhythm of closure. No one tried to stop me. No one dared. In the weeks that followed, the house in Montecito no longer felt like mine. Its walls carried too much cruelty, too many whispered insults, too much greed. I sold it quietly without ceremony and watched movers carry out the last of the furniture. The grand staircase where Harold once stood tall, the roses wilting in the garden, the kitchen where I had written the strategy that saved the company, all of it belonged to the past. I found a small penthouse near the shore in Santa Barbara, its windows opening to the sound of the waves and the scent of salt in the air. The space was simple, bright, unburdened. Each morning I opened the curtains to see the ocean stretching wide and endless, reminding me that beginnings can be found even after endings. The royalties from the patent came steady and sure, but I did not hoard them. I established a foundation, one with a name that mattered to me more than any fortune. Women who were erased. It was a fund meant for women like me, women who had built in silence, who had given without recognition, who had been dismissed until their worth was undeniable. Scholarships grant small acts of dignity offered back to those whose voices had been buried. Word spread quickly. Letters arrived from strangers who had read about the will, about Harold's claws, about the empire built on more than one set of hands. Some wrote of their own mothers, others of grandmothers, aunts, sisters. Each story carried the same ache, the same hunger to be seen. Meanwhile, Daniel and Clarissa disappeared from the center they once craved. Their friends turned their backs, unwilling to be associated with disgrace. The board of Hayes Industries voted swiftly, stripping Daniel of his seat, making it clear he would never carry his father's mantle. Clarissa's name became a hushed whisper in town, her ambition mocked instead of admired. The same neighbors who once envied their lifestyle now shook their heads with pity or scorn. I walked through the streets of Santa Barbara with my head high, not with pride, but with peace. Linda Cooper, my neighbor of many years, stopped me once in the market. "I read the papers," she said softly. "They finally know the truth." Her eyes shone with quiet respect. I smiled at her, but the smile was not triumphant. It was steady, simple, the smile of a woman who had carried a long silence and finally set it down. One evening I sat on my balcony as the sun slipped into the Pacific, the horizon painted in gold and violet. Emily sat beside me, her hand in mine, her voice quiet. "You are stronger than all of them, Grandma." I shook my head gently. "No, my dear. I was only patient." The truth was always strong enough on its own. The waves rolled against the shore, steady and timeless. I thought of Harold of the nights, spent writing by lamplight of the roses in Montecito, of the years I had allowed myself to be unseen. I thought of the moment in that law office, when their laughter died, when silence itself became justice. I whispered into the night, my voice carried by the wind. I do not need revenge. Justice has already spoken. And now, if you have ever been dismissed, overlooked, or made to feel invisible in your own family, I ask you to share your story. Let it be heard. Because every word matters, and together they can change everything.